from Abuja.
It's all about the human struggle to raise the level of living. That's what it's all about. I'm Magnus Packle, and this is Magnus Packle GVA. We appreciate your being a part of our show. In view today, managing Africa's integration, we visit with Mr. Ayodele Aderiwale and Mr. Barack Moluka, following a recent conference in Mombasa, Kenya, as they share their thoughts on how Africa can become more globally competitive through better management. But before that, in our quick view, the impact of China's slowdown on Africa. That's coming up. China's economic performance has indeed been extraordinary, averaging about 10% in real GDP growth from 1977 to 2012, turning it into the second largest economy in the world, with a GDP of about $8.2 trillion, compared to the United States' $16.2 trillion. But then the 2008-2009 global financial crisis happened. To combat the effects of the financial crisis, the Chinese government implemented a stimulus package of about $586 billion aimed at rebuilding its infrastructure, transportation, housing, and other sectors. Even so, after a small rebound in 2010, China has gotten much softer, with real GDP growth trending now around 7.6%. Prior to all this, a fast-growing and hungry China was eating up everything around the world, and especially in Africa. Africa has been benefiting from China's hunger and thirst for its commodities, especially crude oil. China has also been a relatively more active investor in Africa. So, should Africa worry about the seeming economic slowdown in China? China is currently Africa's leading trading partner and one of the main forces behind Africa's annual GDP growth of about 5.5% in the last decade. Around $200 billion worth of goods and services were moved in the last 2 years between Africa and China, much of which were raw materials such as crude oil, copper, base metals, and timber. And the bulk of this trade was with sub-Saharan African countries, notably South Africa, Nigeria, and Angola. Zambia had benefited from its increased export of copper to China, as have Congo and Gabon in their increased exports of timber, also to the land of the Great Wall. A significant drop in China's demand for these products from Africa certainly will have a negative impact on growth and job creation. So maybe we will see after all whether China holds a key for Africa's rapid economic growth. Even so, it is likely to take a while before these impacts become noticeable, considering that there are already a lot of investment projects underway in China, which will continue to require importation of raw materials from Africa through the near term. On a positive note, the slowdown of China's economy, as well as the persistent European economic and financial crisis, could favor Africa, as indeed the new untapped and potentially bountiful frontier. Already, Africa, the motherland of civilization, is starting to show signs that it is waking up. Still in view, Africa can become more globally competitive through better management. But before that, in our Hidden Economics, we take a look at the economics and consequences of sycophancy. Stay with us. Sycophants. That's people who sing praises and flatter influential people in the attempt to win their favor. They are found in the private sector, in government, in politics, educational institutions, and even in places least expected, like religious organizations. The purpose of sycophancy is to gain favor. The sycophant expects to receive favors from the principal using obsequious flattery. That is what some people call brown-nosing or bootlicking. No joke, sycophancy can be a very effective way to work your way up the ladder. How does this happen? What is the nature of the economics of sycophancy? Here is how it works. First, the typical sycophant is lazy and wants to take the short way home. Home is the realization of certain goals and wants. Second, the sycophant often lacks the skill or position needed to achieve the said goals and wants without high-level intervention. To achieve his objective, the sycophant embarks on using excessive flattery to raise the psychic value and worth of the principal. Many influential people in positions of leadership and authority, for any number of reasons, have big egos which somehow they need people to fan with praises, and often without taking the time to figure out if these praises are genuine or not. Because the principal feels a sense of increased worth whenever the sycophant is around, he goes out of his way to keep the sycophant around. But going out of your way can involve high costs. And the costs here can be many and varied. A possible cost is in giving a position or gratuity to the sycophant for his flattery service. But notice that this service is bogus, as the increased self-worth of the principal from the sycophancy is also bogus. Assume that the sycophant, through his charade, is given a key position when he is unqualified. Then society suffers from the sycophancy and the inability to detect it. Quite often and perversely, the sycophant overthrows or betrays his principal after achieving his set goals or wants. This is because of the insincerity often used in packaging the sycophancy in the first place. And then there is the clear issue of work failure that can happen when the principal believes the sycophant much more than the real constructive indicators of job performance that may come from genuine hard-working associates. The cost of sycophancy is huge, as it is private and social. Indeed, pervasive sycophancy is an obvious sign of entrenched corruption. You can be sure that a country that has too much sycophancy has too much corruption. Our hidden economics for you. Last time, we talked about Africa not being adequately and competitively open for trade among its countries. We mentioned the many disadvantages of this poor state of economic integration. Today, we will be continuing our discussion on this matter, laying more emphasis on the importance of good leadership in promoting inclusive growth, economic integration, and competitiveness among African countries. To discuss this important subject, we were privileged to have on the side of a recent international conference in Mombasa, Kenya, Mr. Ayodele Aderiwale, Executive Director, Africa Leadership Forum in Lagos, and Mr. Barak Muluka, Head, Africa Governance, Leadership and Management Secretariat in Nairobi, Kenya. Please join me as we have our discussion over the noise of the waves and winds of the Indian Ocean in Mombasa, Kenya. Okay, Barak and Ayo, wonderful to be here talking to you guys. You guys did a wonderful job, excellent job, extraordinary job in putting up this conference, this African Leadership and Management Convention. And this is the fourth time that you have done it, and in this very beautiful location here in Mombasa. So this has just been extraordinary, and you did a wonderful job. So I want to stay on the issue of leadership. We've talked about opening up Africa to Africa, the role of entrepreneurship, the role of the private sector, and of communication and all of that. But I think in the end, it's really about leadership. Who puts it together? You can have land, labor, capital, but you gotta have entrepreneurship. You gotta have somebody to put it all together. So, how are we doing in Africa in terms of putting together our way forward? The pathway to progress, to where we can bring everybody in. We're talking about inclusive growth and all of that. How successful have we been over the last several years, and what does the future look like in terms of leadership, putting it all together?
I would say, particularly probably in the last 20 years, there has emerged in Africa a new set of political leadership, even economic and particularly social leadership. If you look, this is Africa that is different. As you heard during the conference, today you have an Africa where governors of central banks of Africa have agreed that a certain percentage of their strategic reserve, which is usually warehoused in Paris, in London, in Washington, is going to be pulled together into an investable fund of $100 billion American dollars for infrastructural development in Africa. We have in Africa today a situation where Rwanda has the ability to attract better terms in terms of finance than Spain or Ireland from the capital market. What does that tell you? In very clear terms, there is on the continent, in several places, a new crop of leadership. It's a different day in Africa, and that, for me, is indicative of the level of progress we have made, and is a pointer to the possibilities ahead.
Right, we thought that early on, around the 1960s, when we had a slew of countries gaining independence, we thought that was easy at that time because they had one common goal, that is, liberate Africa, gain independence for Africa. But then we also then thought that it became a little bit more difficult because it was one thing to do the wedding, but it was another thing to now hold the marriage together. How to keep Africa going, how to get economic development going became a problem. But I would just say now that we're doing well. Do you see it the same way?
Possibly, but with a bit of variance. That we still have got governance and leadership issues that we need to address, and that we must indeed address. Because when we talk about the liberation years, we're essentially saying that we have those nationalists, but we're also saying that liberate this space so that it can belong to me, so that in the place of the departing colonial governor, I can be the person in charge. And it is true that the first generation of leaders, even including Kwame Nkrumah himself, started placing themselves on certain kinds of deified platforms. They became fathers of the nations. They were philosophers. They were Osayevos. They were lions like the Ngwazi, Dr. Kamuzu Banda of Malawi, and Mobutu Sese Seko of initially Congo, then Zaire. And what we see there was that it was a leadership that lost the sense of direction. So we must ask ourselves fundamental questions about, for example, the kind of state that is going to enable the sort of things that we are talking about. Is the state going to be a state that is serving the people, that is serving the African nation, or is it going to be a state that is serving the governor, the president, the prime minister, and a cabal, a few people around him or around her?
These are all complicated issues, and I want to come back to Aya here now. Is leadership more complicated today than before because of globalization, because of the integration needs, because of the changes, very rapid, dynamic situations that we have now, rapid changes that are taking place in the world today? Is it a little bit more difficult for our leaders today than it was, say, at independence?
No, actually, I would think that today it's a lot less difficult, and a lot less complicated. Step back. In the past, look at independence. Look at the role of the Seven Sisters when it came, particularly, for instance, to crude oil. And now they were just taking the crude oil almost for free, $1 a barrel at best. Look at where we are today in terms of our commodity prices. Look at how we were selling to Europe our commodities were even being undervalued. Today, Africa is getting a higher value for its commodities in the first instance. Number two,
but is that because of African leadership or because
it's
of
not
global
particularly
trends?
because of there are trends, there are developments, particularly in Asia. China, India, and other countries in Asia are making increasing demand. Now, there's also coming along that the democratization of access to technology in terms of that. It means also we have an alternative. We can always negotiate and get better terms in terms of our economic relationship. Again, because of developments in ICT, access to information is universal, is democratized. Again, the level, take for instance at independence, a particular African country, in the Ministry of Education, there were only 5 people who read and write. The Minister of Education was a 23-year-old fresh university graduate. Again, in another country, the first university graduate ended up becoming the president. They didn't have people who could really work with them. Even they themselves had very limited understanding of the world in which they were operating. Today is different. There is hardly any African leader who can give such lame excuse such as I don't have the resource base. So, for me, right now, it is not as difficult as it used to be in the past. Africans now understand that they have to be responsible for themselves. So, at least in several instances.
Now, this conference we just had, how do we drill this down to the community level, to guys at the lower level, so that leadership we talk about not only just resides at the top, but also happens at the bottom?
Yeah, first, I don't agree with my brother here that people are any better informed at school today, especially those who are ascending to cadres of political leadership, than they were in those years. In Nigeria itself, you had Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, who was very well educated in those days. You had the likes of Chief Obafemi Awolowo, who are very well learned, not just educated here in Africa, but they had graced European universities, and some of the finest. Kwame himself had taken a doctorate wherever it was. Ngwazi, Dr. Kamuzu Banda, had been working in the United Kingdom, and he was a very learned person. Dr. Milton Obote was a very learned person in Uganda, and there were many others.
But maybe they didn't have the resources to
work
work
on and on. The resources were there. In fact, these people inherited very good and functional economies, with the exception of perhaps Guinea, where the French went away with everything, including the smallest paperclip in the office, because Ahmed Sekou said that he wanted independence here and now, while the France of Charles de Gaulle was proposing a policy of gradualism in the attainment of independence in French colonies in Africa. So I think that the focus was completely wrong.
Any final thoughts now, Ayo, on the whole thing of leadership, how we put it all together for the progress of Africa? How we pull all our resources together, all our efforts together for making sure that we stay on a path where we can grow even stronger. Because I think we have to grow much stronger than we're growing now, even at 5-6%, if we're going to catch up with the rest of the world.
Let me tell you, there's today, imagine what I call a liberation army. And that liberation army is the African private sector. It is growing. It is getting a lot of strength and support. And the private sector has a liberating influence on any economy. They're liberalizing the energy, the energy sector. You're bringing a lot of private sector investment, huge. All of this, as they begin to unravel, as they begin to take place in different parts of Africa. That's why I call the African private sector a liberation army.
Absolutely.
They will turn the things around. We will have a positive state that will be there, that will continue to support the private sector. But in terms of breaking down issues about poverty, in terms of advancing progress and the rest of it, it is this liberation army that will be in the vanguard of taking us to the promised land.
Thank you very much, Ayo. Fantastic. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Dr. Wonderful.
Botswana, the world's largest producer of gem diamond, now stands out as one of Africa's star performers in economic development, with a GDP per capita of over $7,000, compared to a sub-Saharan average of under $1,400. Botswana's impressive economic record has been built on a foundation of diamond mining, prudent fiscal policies, and a pragmatic foreign policy. It is rated the least corrupt country in Africa, according to Transparency International. Botswana has apparently done a wonderful job in managing its natural resources, especially its diamond reserves, so much it has avoided the so-called resource curse that abundant natural resources have brought to nations such as Democratic Republic of Congo, Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. The government of Botswana protects its mining industry from illegal trade in diamond with full and transparent commitment, especially since its signing of the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme, KPCS, which was established in 2003 to prevent diamond from getting into the illegal rough diamond market. To let the experience of Botswana ring and be echoed across Africa, the leadership story from every country, especially with regard to resource management and job growth, will have to become more encouraging. For African countries to effectively raise the quality of life for its people, real GDP growth in each country will have to average about 10% a year for at least 10 years. After all, many of the countries that are being heralded today as exemplary in growth and development maintained extraordinarily high rates of economic growth for around 30 years, as earlier noted for China. Even Botswana has had many long periods when its real GDP growth averaged about 10% annually. It's all about how well the economy is managed. For African countries to be successful, there will have to be increased mass participation in the economic development process. This is what people now call inclusive growth. Inclusive growth can help propel the so-called impressive 5% African economic growth to near 10%. When will this happen? It will happen when countries empower and encourage lower third governments and peoples to take more ownership of their own economic destiny. Old strategies have failed. At the EBS, we have developed new strategies for refined economic development to help governments create the environment for the private sector to generate jobs at the community level and spur stronger economic growth rates for nations. Using inclusive growth strategies and improved management of our vast natural resources, Africa will lift its level of living and performance and become more competitive in the global economy. I'm Magnus Packel, and that's my view.
Hallelujah.